The door to the Redemption Creek jailhouse swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and Elsie Langston stood in the doorway with rain hammering down behind her like the sky itself had broken open to weep. Deputy Jasper Warren looked up from his desk, one hand already moving instinctively toward the iron at his hip, and then he saw her face, and everything inside him went still. She was soaked through to the bone. Her brown hair was plastered flat against her cheeks, her traveling dress was torn at the hem, and she was clutching a carpetbag to her chest like it was the last thing on earth she owned. Which, he would later understand it was. "He told me the house was mine," she said, and her voice was so steady it frightened him, the kind of steadiness that comes right before a person shatters completely. "He told me I would have a home, a life, a husband. He told me those things in 17 letters over 6 months, deputy, and every single word was a lie." Jasper was on his feet without remembering standing. "Who told you? Who are you?" "My name is Elsie Langston. I came from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania on a train and then a stagecoach, and then a wagon driven by a man who smelled like something had died inside him. And I arrived in this town 4 hours ago to find that my intended, a Mr. Gerald Fitch, is already married." She set the carpetbag down on his floor with a soft, final thud. "He has a wife and 2 children and a very nice house that he never once mentioned in his letters. And the boarding house here does not take women alone, and the hotel costs more than I have left, and I do not know what to do." The rain outside intensified, thunder rolling across the flatlands like God clearing his throat. Jasper Warren stared at this woman in his doorway, and he felt something shift in his chest that he had no name for yet, something that felt like the ground moving beneath his boots, slow and certain and irreversible. He reached up and took his hat off. "Miss Langston," he said, "you had better come inside." 6 months before that storm-soaked evening in the spring of 1883, Elsie Langston had been a seamstress in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, living in 2 rented rooms above a tailor shop, and surviving on careful work and careful savings, and a careful sort of hope. She was 24 years old, and she had buried both her parents within the same terrible winter, her mother in November and her father in February. And the world she had known for her entire life had contracted to those 2 small rooms, and the sound of her own footsteps on bare floorboards. She was not a woman prone to recklessness. She had never been impulsive, never been wild, never been the kind of girl who chased something without thinking it through. But grief does strange things to a person's calculations, and when her friend Martha had shown her the advertisement in the back of a women's periodical about a successful rancher in the New Mexico territory seeking a respectable wife with needle skills and a steady disposition, something had flickered to life inside her that felt dangerously close to wanting. She had written the first letter cautiously, asking only simple questions about the town of Redemption Creek, the ranching life, what a woman might expect. Gerald Fitch had written back beautifully. That was the truth of it, and it shamed her to admit how completely she had believed in those letters, how carefully she had read each word, how she had fallen asleep more than once holding paper to her chest. He had described sunsets over Red Canyon walls. He had described the smell of sage after rain. He had described a stone house with a wide porch and a spare room waiting to be turned into a sewing room just for her. He had been thoughtful and warm and intelligent, and he had never once mentioned the wife he had married 3 years prior. The fraud of it was staggering in its completeness. He had clearly run this scheme before, Jasper would tell her later, had used the false promise of marriage to secure household labor from women desperate enough to cross the country on faith alone. Elsie had arrived to find not just a married man, but a man who seemed genuinely offended that she expected him to account for his lies, who had told her flatly that he would pay her a wage to work in his household as a domestic if she wished to stay, and had then turned back to his dinner when she did not answer. She had picked up her carpetbag and walked out into the gathering storm and kept walking until she saw the faint lamp glow of the jailhouse. Jasper Warren had been deputy of Redemption Creek for 3 years. He was 29 years old, and he had come west from Missouri following the death of his older brother in a cattle drive accident. A dark chapter he rarely spoke of, but that had carved itself permanently into the lines around his eyes. He was a quiet man by nature and by habit, not cold but contained, the sort of man who listened more than he spoke and thought more than he acted, which made him a good deputy even if it had made him a somewhat mysterious figure to the residents of the town. He had never married. There had been a woman once in Missouri, but that story had ended badly, and he had sealed it up behind him like a room in a house he no longer lived in. He shared quarters in the back of the jailhouse, 2 small rooms built on as an afterthought, with a narrow cot and a wood stove and a window that looked out onto the horse corral. It was not luxury, but it was shelter, and as he stood looking at Elsie Langston dripping on his floor, her chin up and her jaw set and her eyes holding back something that he recognized as the specific dignity of a person refusing to break down in front of a stranger, he made his decision before he even consciously reached it. "You'll take my rooms," he said. Elsie blinked. "I beg your pardon. My quarters are through that door. There's a stove and a cot and a wash basin. I'll get a fire going." He was already moving toward the back door. "I cannot take your rooms, deputy. You live here." "I'll sleep in the stable." He said it simply, like it was nothing, like it was the most obvious solution in the world. "There's a dry stall and extra blankets in the tack room. I've slept in worse." "You cannot sleep in a stable on my account." Her voice was firm, but there was something cracking beneath it, a hairline fracture of disbelief at the straightforward decency of the offer. Jasper turned to look at her fully. "Miss Langston, you were brought here under false pretenses by a man who should answer for that crime, and you are standing in a rainstorm with nowhere to go. I am the law in this town when Sheriff Calloway is out on patrol, which he is, and it is my job to see to the safety of everyone in Redemption Creek." He paused. "That includes you. Now let me get that stove lit before you catch your death." She stared at him for a long moment in the lamplight, this quiet deputy with the steady eyes and the hat in his hands, and something passed through her expression that she could not have named any better than he could have named the thing that shifted in his own chest. "Thank you," she said. It came out barely above a whisper. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "The mattress is terrible," she laughed. It surprised them both, this small, genuine, startled laugh in the middle of everything, and Jasper Warren turned quickly toward the stove before she could see what it did to his face. He spent that first night in the stable, wrapped in a horse blanket in a dry stall beside a roan gelding named Copper who seemed entirely unbothered by the company. The rain hammered the roof, and the thunder walked across the hills, and Jasper lay on his back in the dark and stared at the boards above him and thought about a woman who had crossed the entire country on the word of a liar, and the way she had laughed at the end of the worst day of her life. He did not sleep much. In the morning he was back at his desk before dawn, having washed at the trough and straightened his badge and put on the cleanest shirt he owned. And when Elsie emerged from the back rooms at sunrise, she found a pot of coffee on the small iron stove in the jailhouse office and a paper-wrapped package of corn bread from the bakery 2 streets over, which had opened early. She stopped in the doorway of the back room, her hair properly pinned and her dress smoothed as well as could be managed after a night in a carpetbag, and she looked at the coffee and the corn bread and then at Jasper, who was reading a week-old newspaper and pretending he had not heard her come in. "You went out this morning," she said. "Bakery opens at 5, he said, not looking up. "Deputy Warren." He looked up. "I need to make some decisions," she said. "Practical ones. About money and about whether there is any legitimate work to be found in this town. I cannot impose on your shelter indefinitely, and I will not." He folded the newspaper. "What kind of work can you do?" "I am an excellent seamstress. I can also keep books, having done so for the tailor shop in Harrisburg for 2 years. I can cook tolerably well. I have some teaching experience, though I am not formally certified." Jasper leaned back in his chair. "There's a woman on the east end of town, widow named Clara Benton, who runs a dry goods store. She's been doing her own alterations, and she's complained more than once about the quality of her work. I can take you to her this morning if you're willing." "I am willing," Elsie said. "But first—" She reached into her carpetbag, which she had carried from the back room, and withdrew a small leather purse. "What does the boarding house charge by the week? I will pay you whatever that rate is for the use of your rooms. I will not accept charity." Jasper opened his mouth and then closed it again. "I mean it," she said. "The boarding house charges $2 a week. Then that is what I will pay you. Once I have found work and drawn a wage." She met his eyes steadily. "We can consider it a debt in the meantime," he should have argued. He knew she was proud and that the offer was important to her dignity, and he also knew he was going to take exactly none of her money, but he recognized this was not the moment to say so. "Agreed," he said. "Let me finish this coffee, and I'll walk you to Clara Benton's." Redemption Creek was a town of approximately 400 souls sitting in the high desert of the New Mexico Territory, cradled between red clay bluffs to the north and a wide dry wash to the south that ran with water only during spring rains. It had grown up around a silver mining operation that had slowed significantly in the last 5 years, which meant the town had that particular character of places that had once expected to be large and had learned to be content with smaller ambitions. There was a main street with a hotel, 2 saloons, a general store, a post office, a church of nonspecific Protestant denomination, the jailhouse, a blacksmith, and the dry goods store run by Clara Benton. There were side streets and a schoolhouse and a doctor's office and a scattering of houses from the modest to the comfortable. Gerald Fitch's Stone Ranch house sat 2 miles out of town and was visible from the main road, and every time Elsie walked the length of the main street in those early days, she could see it in the distance like a reminder of a trap she had nearly walked fully into. Clara Benton was a sharp-eyed woman of 50 who had come west with her late husband during the silver boom and had outlasted him and outlasted the boom and was doing perfectly fine on her own, thank you. She looked Elsie up and down on the doorstep of the dry goods store with the frank appraisal of a woman who had learned to read people fast and without sentiment. "Warren vouches for you," she said, eyeing Jasper, who stood on the step behind Elsie. "I do," Jasper said. "Can you tailor a man's suit coat?" Clara asked Elsie directly. "I can," Elsie said. "I can also do fine dress alterations, mending, quilting, hemwork, and if you have a pattern for any standard garment I can produce it to measure. There are 3 women in this town who have been waiting 6 months for someone capable of shortening their store-bought gowns without ruining them." Clara stood aside from the door. "Come in. Let me show you the back room." Jasper waited on the step with his hands in his coat pockets and listened to the murmur of voices inside, and when Elsie came back out 15 minutes later, there was color in her face that had nothing to do with the morning air. "She is paying me $4 a week and the use of her back room as a workspace," Elsie said. "And she has 3 clients immediately." "Good," Jasper said. "That is very good," Elsie said, and she was almost smiling, real and unguarded, and it hit him somewhere behind his sternum like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples outward in all directions. He was beginning to understand in a significant amount of trouble. The days settled into a rhythm. Elsie worked at Clara Benton's dry goods store during the day, taking her meals at the small diner on the corner of Main and 2nd, where the widow who owned it charged a fair price and asked no uncomfortable questions. In the evenings she returned to the deputy's quarters, and in the mornings she made coffee on the little stove and left a cup on Jasper's desk before she left, which she had begun doing on the 3rd day without comment, and which he had accepted without comment, though the first morning he had stood staring at the cup for a solid minute before picking it up. He slept in the stable every night. Copper the roan had become accustomed to his presence, and Jasper had improved his situation with a proper bedroll and a 2nd lantern, and there was something almost companionable about the arrangement, the warm animal smell of the horses and the quiet breathing of the night. He told himself it was no hardship. He had slept on the ground on cattle drives as a young man. He had slept in far worse places during the hard winter after his brother died. But he had never had the particular difficulty of lying awake at night knowing that just through the wall of the jailhouse, separated from him by one door and one thin partition, a woman was sleeping who had begun to occupy his thoughts in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to categorize as purely professional concern. He watched her from a distance, the way she moved through the town, straight-backed and deliberate, learning the streets and the faces with a quiet determination that told him she was not planning to leave. He watched the way she spoke to people, direct and warm in equal measure, no pretense or performance. He watched her refuse to be diminished by what had been done to her, and this more than anything knocked the breath out of him on a regular basis. On the 8th day after her arrival, Gerald Fitch came into the jailhouse. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with the careful dress and the easy manner of someone who had learned that confidence and presentation could substitute for character in most social situations. He sat down across from Jasper's desk without being invited and set his hat on the corner of the desk without being invited to do that either. And Jasper looked at him with an expression that had been described by various criminals as making them feel the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. "I imagine you know who I am," Fitch said. "I do," Jasper said. "The woman that came in on the stage last week, Miss Langston. I understand she's been staying here." "She has." "I'd like her gone, Deputy. She's a disruption. My wife is upset. The town's talking." Jasper looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "The correspondence was a misunderstanding," Fitch said, spreading his hands in a gesture of reasonable men settling a simple matter. "I may have given her the wrong impression. These things happen. She should take the stage back east and we can all move on." "She came from Pennsylvania on your invitation, Mr. Fitch," Jasper said. "She spent her savings on that journey. She arrived to find that you had concealed a legal marriage for the purpose of inducing her to travel here under false pretenses. Now that's a strong way to put it." "That is the accurate way to put it." Jasper's voice had not changed in volume or tone at any point. "What you did may well constitute criminal fraud. I have not yet determined whether to pursue charges." Fitch's easy manner shifted slightly, a fracture in the surface. "That's a serious accusation." "It is. I would advise you to leave this office, Mr. Fitch, and to stay well away from Miss Langston. If she chooses to file a formal complaint, I will act on it. If you approach her or pressure her in any way, I will consider that intimidation and respond accordingly." Jasper stood, which brought him to a height that was not unusually tall but which somehow always seemed to fill the room. "We understand each other." Fitch picked up his hat. His face had gone red and then pale and had settled somewhere in between. "You're making an enemy, Warren." "I've had worse ones," Jasper said. "Good day, Mr. Fitch." He told Elsie about the visit that evening. She was sitting in the one chair in the jailhouse office that was not his desk chair, mending a shirt that belonged to old Tom Hatch the blacksmith, which Clara Benton had passed along as a side commission, and she went very still when he described what had been said. "He wants me gone," she said. "He wants you gone," Jasper confirmed. "I want you to know that has no bearing on your situation here. You are welcome to stay as long as you need." She looked up from the mending. "Do you think he would actually cause trouble?" Jasper considered being honest versus being reassuring and chose honesty because she struck him as a woman who would find dishonest comfort more insulting than the truth. "Fitch has influence in this town. He employs several men. He sits on the town council, and he's friendly with some people I'd rather not have as obstacles. I don't think he'll move against you directly, but I'd be careful about walking alone after dark." "That is not the most comforting assessment," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you asked." Something in her expression softened. "I did ask. Thank you for not lying to me about it." Their eyes held for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then Elsie looked back down at the shirt in her hands and Jasper stood up to add wood to the stove, and neither of them spoke for a while, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that builds slowly into something, the way a house is built, one piece at a time, until one day you look up and realize you are standing inside walls. Sheriff Ben Calloway returned to Redemption Creek on a Thursday morning near the end of Elsie's second week, riding in from the east with trail dust on his coat and the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent too many days in the saddle chasing something that kept not quite being where he expected. He was a man of 52 with silver hair and a methodical character who had run Redemption Creek's law since before the silver played out, and he had a great deal of respect for Jasper Warren, whom he had hired away from a cattle operation 3 years prior on the strength of a single conversation, and had never regretted it. He found the jailhouse in good order, which was no surprise. He found 3 written reports on his desk in Jasper's precise handwriting documenting various minor incidents that had occurred during his absence. He found the coffee hot, and he found, when he opened the back door to check his own quarters, that they were occupied by a woman's carpetbag and a woman's sewing basket and a woman who was not there but who had clearly been sleeping on his deputy's cot. He sat down at his desk and read the report that Jasper had written about the Elsie Langston situation, which was thorough and factual, and which included a note at the bottom saying that the deputy had taken the stable quarters while Miss Langston remained in the back rooms, and that this arrangement would continue until suitable alternatives were secured. Calloway read this report twice. Then he poured himself a cup of coffee and waited. Jasper came in from outside with a feed bucket in one hand and hay on his shoulder because he had been tending the horses, and he stopped when he saw the sheriff at the desk. "Morning, sir," he said. "Morning." Calloway looked at the hay on his deputy's shoulder. "You've been sleeping in the stable." "Yes, sir." "How long?" 2 weeks. Calloway drank his coffee. "The back rooms are mine, Warren, not yours to give away." Jasper set the feed bucket down. He had thought about this conversation. "Yes, sir. I apologize for not having consulted you first. I'll make other arrangements immediately." "What other arrangements?" "I'll speak to Clara Benton about whether Miss Langston might board with her. Or I'll find another solution." "I'm not telling you to move her out," Calloway said in a tone of mild exasperation. "I'm telling you that you should have sent word. I've been on the trail, not on the moon." He set his cup down. "She's staying. She seems to want to. Fitch put up a fuss. He came in and suggested she should leave. I suggested otherwise." Calloway rubbed his jaw. "Fitch is a problem that's been building. You know he's run this kind of scheme before. I suspected. You have information." "Heard things from the Roswell sheriff when I was passing through. There was a woman in Clayton 2 years back, similar situation. She went home before anything formal was brought." "Fitch counted on the same here." Calloway stood. "Well, he didn't count on you." He looked at his deputy steadily. "You like this woman." Jasper picked up the feed bucket again. "She's had a hard time of it." "That wasn't what I asked." A pause. "She's a good person," Jasper said, which was not exactly an answer and was entirely an answer, and Calloway let it lie. "I'll take the back rooms tonight," the sheriff said. "You can have the bunk room if you need it, Warren, and we'll figure out a better situation for Miss Langston." He paused at his office door. "Or you could just marry her." Jasper stared at him. Calloway disappeared into the back rooms with his saddlebag. Jasper stood alone in the jailhouse with hay on his shoulder and a feed bucket in his hand, and the distinct sensation of the world quietly rearranging itself around him. The question of longer-term arrangements resolved itself through Clara Benton, who had taken a considerable liking to Elsie, and who had a spare bedroom on the upper floor of her house on the east end of town that she had been meaning to let, but had not gotten around to advertising. She offered it to Elsie at a rate that was just below what Elsie could afford with her wages, and Elsie accepted with the same quiet practicality she brought to everything, and the carpetbag moved from Jasper's quarters to Clara's spare room on a Saturday morning in early April. Jasper carried the bag. It was not heavy. He set it down inside Clara's front door, and Elsie took it from him, and there was a moment on Clara's porch in the cool morning air where they both stood looking at the street without saying anything. "You must be glad to have your rooms back," Elsie said. "The stable wasn't so bad," he said. "Copper's good company." She laughed, and he had begun to catalogue her laughter, the different varieties of it, the polite social laugh and the startled genuine laugh, and this one, which was warmer and more private, like something she was sharing rather than just expressing. "I want to thank you," she said, "properly, not just for the rooms, for all of it. For taking Fitch seriously and for going to Clara and for just," she stopped, "for being what you are, I suppose." "What am I?" he asked, and it came out quieter than he intended, less like a deflection and more like a genuine question. She looked at him directly, and Elsie Langston, when she looked at you directly, looked at you with her whole self, nothing withheld or deflected. "You're a good man, Jasper Warren. I don't say that lightly. I have had occasion recently to recalibrate my assessment of what a good man looks like, and you have set the bar quite high." He could not think of a single thing to say to that. The morning light was doing something to her hair, finding the warmth in the brown of it, and Clara Benton was almost certainly watching from the upstairs window, and he was a deputy with a badge on his chest and a reputation for being composed, and all of those things together were only barely sufficient to stop him from saying something he was not yet sure he was permitted to say. "Well," he managed. "You're very welcome." She smiled. She went inside. He walked back to the jailhouse and spent 20 minutes doing absolutely nothing at his desk. Spring deepened, and the desert did what deserts do in spring, which is to say it flowered with a brief violent extravagance before the heat pressed everything back down to brown endurance. Elsie had been in Redemption Creek for 6 weeks, and then 8 weeks, and then 10, and in that time she had built something that looked increasingly like a life. She had more clients than she could manage alone, and had begun to train a young woman named Pilar Vega, whose family had been in the territory since before it was a territory, in the fine work of tailoring. She had joined the church and had been approached about helping with the Sunday school, which she agreed to on a trial basis. She had become a regular presence at the diner on the corner, and knew the names of most of the people on Main Street, and most of them knew hers. She had also become a regular presence in Jasper Warren's life in ways that could be precisely described, and were therefore somewhat dangerous to describe too precisely, since precise description would require her to admit things she was not entirely certain of yet. He walked her home from the diner in the evenings more often than not, because it was on his way, which was only barely true geographically, but which neither of them examined. They had developed the habit of talking on Clara Benton's porch before she went in, sometimes for 20 minutes and sometimes for an hour, standing in the evening air while the stars came out over the desert, talking about everything and nothing in the way of people who have discovered they can talk to each other without managing themselves. He told her about Missouri, small pieces at a time. His brother Daniel's death, which had been a fall from a horse during a river crossing, stupid and random and complete. His decision to come west, which had been less decision and more motion, the need to be somewhere that did not contain Daniel's absence in every familiar corner. The slow process of finding something in Redemption Creek that felt worth staying for. She told him about Harrisburg, about her parents, about the 2 rented rooms that had seemed adequate, and then small, and then suffocating after they were gone. About the letters from Gerald Fitch and the hope she had allowed herself, and the shame of that hope after the truth was revealed, the particular shame of having wanted something badly enough to believe in it without enough evidence. "There is no shame in wanting a life," Jasper said one evening, leaning against the porch rail with the night sky enormous above them. "There's shame in being taken in," she said. Fitch was practiced. He had done it before, and he was good at it. You did not fail to see through him, Elsie. He worked to be invisible. He was quiet for a moment. "When I first came west, I trusted a man who told me he knew of honest work and good pay, and he led 3 of us into something close to bondage on a ranch in Texas, working for wages that never quite materialized in a situation we could not easily leave. It took me 2 months to find a way out of it, and I lost those wages entirely." He paused. "Was that my failure?" She turned to look at him. "Of course not." "Then allow me the same courtesy," he said quietly. The silence that followed was different from previous silences. It was charged with something specific and mutual, and Elsie became very aware of how close they were standing in the narrow space of the porch, and of the fact that Jasper Warren was looking at her with an expression that was no longer entirely unreadable. "Jasper," she said. "Yes," he said, which was not a response to anything she had said yet, but which seemed to answer several things at once. She laughed helplessly, and the charged moment dissolved into something warmer and more comfortable, and he smiled, which was still rare enough that it stopped her breath slightly every time. "Good night, Deputy," she said. "Good night, Miss Langston," he said. She went inside. He stood on the porch for another minute looking at the stars. It was Sheriff Calloway who finally said the thing that needed to be said. In the direct and economical way he handled most situations. He had been watching his deputy for 3 months with the patience of a man who has spent decades reading situations and knows better than to rush a slow burn, and one afternoon in June he came in from patrol, unsaddled his horse, came into the office, sat down and said, "Warren, are you planning to court that woman, or are you planning to stand on her porch indefinitely looking like a man with something to say?" Jasper set his pen down very carefully. "Because she's a good woman and she won't wait forever," Calloway continued in the tone of a man discussing the weather. "She's got 3 marriage proposals already, in case you weren't aware. Hector Davies asked her in April, and she turned him down politely. Sam Good from the mining office asked her in May, and she turned him down less politely. And young Tom Reeves from the livery has been bringing her flowers that she keeps giving to Clara Benton because she doesn't want to encourage him." Jasper stood up from his desk so abruptly that his chair scraped the floor. "I suggest you work out what you actually want," Calloway said, "before someone else decides for you." The thing was, Jasper knew what he wanted. He had known for some weeks with a clarity that was no longer deniable, and that had begun to affect his sleep and his appetite, and his ability to write reports without going back to reread sentences he had read 3 times already. He wanted Elsie Langston with the specific and total wanting of a man who has been careful for so long that when something real finally presents itself, the contrast is almost violent. He was afraid. This was the honest answer that he had been sitting with and not examining too closely, because examining it required admitting the shape of the dark past he carried. The woman in Missouri whose name was Margaret and who had told him when she left that he was too closed, too quiet, too entirely inside himself to be loved by anyone who needed to be met halfway. He had believed her. He had come west partly believing her, and some portion of that belief had persisted even when the rest of him had rebuilt into something calmer and more purposeful. He was afraid that he would say the thing he needed to say to Elsie Langston, and that she would look at him with that direct, clear gaze, and find that whatever was there was not enough. He went to Clara Benton's porch that evening and he waited, and when Elsie came home from the store with a bolt of fabric under her arm and her hair loosening slightly from its morning arrangement and a smudge of chalk dust on her left wrist, she stopped when she saw him standing there and something moved across her face before she composed it. "Good evening," she said carefully. "Good evening." He took the bolt of fabric from her automatically, which made her blink. "I need to say something to you." "All right," she said. "I'm not good at saying things," he said. "I want to acknowledge that in advance so that you will have the appropriate context." "I have noticed that about you," she said, "and I have never found it to be a problem." He looked at her. She was standing on the second step of Clara's porch, which put her eyes close to level with his, and the evening light was doing its things again, and somewhere down the street someone was playing a harmonica badly. "I think you are extraordinary," he said. "I think you came to a terrible situation, and you made something out of it that most people would not have made, and I think you are strong and funny and honest and kind, and I have been sleeping in a stable for 3 months." He stopped. "That last part is not exactly relevant." What I mean is that I would very much like to court you, Miss Langston, if you are willing, and I would very much like you to know that I am saying that with complete seriousness and without any hidden motive or dark past scheme, and that if you say yes, I intend to be extremely straightforward about all of it, because you have had enough of men who were not straightforward. Elsie set her hand on the porch rail and looked at him for a moment that felt like a very long time and was probably 5 seconds. "Jasper Warren," she said. "Yes. I have been waiting for approximately 6 weeks for you to say something along those lines." He blinked. "You have." "I have been monumentally patient," she said. "Ask Clara, she has heard all about it." He stared at her, and something that had been held very tightly in his chest for a very long time loosened, like a knot finally slipping free, and the relief of it was almost dizzying. "I am sorry for the delay," he said. "Yes, you should be," she said, and she was laughing, and he was laughing quietly the way he did everything, and she stepped down from the step and took the bolt of fabric back from him and said, "Walk me inside and I'll make you some coffee and we can discuss the terms of this courtship like civilized people." "Terms," he said. "I have some thoughts," she said. He followed her inside and spent the next 2 hours drinking coffee at Clara Benton's kitchen table, while Elsie outlined her thoughts on courtship with the same systematic intelligence she brought to alterations contracts. And Clara Benton sat in the corner pretending to read and smiling at her knitting with great satisfaction. The courtship was, by Redemption Creek standards, both decorous and obvious to everyone within a half-mile radius. They walked together in the evenings. He escorted her to the church social in July and danced with her twice, which was noticed and discussed at length. He brought her wildflowers once in late July, which he presented with such a precise lack of ceremony that she laughed for 30 seconds and then kept them in a jar on Clara's windowsill until they were dust. He learned her. This was the best way to describe what the months of walking and talking and sitting on porches had been: a slow and careful learning of another person, the kind that you cannot rush and cannot shortcut, and that is different from anything else in the way that a real foundation is different from the appearance of one. He learned that she was funny in a dry way that took you by surprise, that she was braver than she believed herself to be, that she had a habit of pressing her thumbnail against her lower lip when she was thinking through a problem, that she was quietly furious about injustice in a way that she expressed through practical action rather than declaration, that she had already, by August, helped 2 women in Redemption Creek navigate situations not entirely unlike her own, pointing them toward their own resources and their own capability with the steady matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has done it herself. That she sang to herself while she worked, quietly, half-hummed snatches of hymns and parlor songs, and that she stopped immediately if she thought anyone could hear her, which meant that the 2 times Jasper heard it, both times coming around a corner without warning, were both times that he filed away with the particular care he reserved for things that mattered enormously. He learned that she was afraid of the dark past she carried, not the events of it, the death of her parents and the fraud of Fitch, but the interpretation of it, the worry that it said something about her choices or her judgment. That underneath the steady competence she had built there was still a woman who had crossed the country on hope and been betrayed and was not entirely done flinching. He told her this one evening in September when the first cool of autumn had arrived and the desert had shifted from blinding gold to something deeper and more amber. "You are not marked by it," he said. "What happened to you? It is a thing that happened, not a thing that defines you." She was quiet for a while. They were on a bench outside the post office, having come from the direction of the diner, and the main street was quiet in the evening. "You told me once about what happened to you in Texas," she said. "And who misled you? You told me it was not my failure with Fitch. Do you believe the same of your own experience, or is there a different standard?" He was quiet. "I thought so," she said, not unkindly. "We're a pair," he said. "We are," she agreed. "2 people sitting on a bench in a territorial town telling each other to believe things about themselves that they have trouble believing about themselves." He looked at her. She was looking at the middle distance with a faint smile. "Elsie," he said. "Jasper. I am going to ask you something, and I would prefer to ask it properly, but I am not entirely sure how to do that properly, so I am going to ask it in the way I know, which is directly." She turned to look at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build a life with you here in this town, and I want to do it honestly and carefully and for a very long time. I am aware that you came west once before seeking marriage and that it went badly, and I am aware that asking you to try again requires you to trust something you have good reason to distrust." He held her gaze. "I cannot promise you that nothing will be hard. But I can promise you that I will never lie to you, and I will never scheme, and I will never be anything other than what I am, which is a man who loves you completely and who has been trying to find the right words for that for 3 months. She was very still. "That is the most you have ever said consecutively," she said finally. "Yes," he agreed. Her eyes had gone bright, not crying, but something close, something that was the feeling before feeling when a thing is very real and very large. She reached out and took his hand, which was warm and rough and very steady. "Jasper Warren," she said, "you have been completely transparent from the first moment I walked into your jailhouse. There is no dark past here, no hidden motive, no trap. There is only you exactly as you are." She squeezed his hand. "Yes, I will marry you, very gratefully and entirely of my own free will and without any need for a scheme or a contract or a periodical advertisement." He laughed, brief and real. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. They sat on the bench for a while longer, her hand in his, the autumn evening settling around them, and Redemption Creek went about its business with no idea yet that one of its quieter love stories had just reached a turning point. Gerald Fitch, in the meantime, had not been entirely quiet. He had complained to the town council in August about the deputy's behavior, framing it as professional overreach and personal bias, and 3 of the 5 council members had heard him out with varying degrees of skepticism. Jasper had been called to account before the council in a brief and somewhat awkward meeting in which Calloway had attended uninvited, and had expressed his complete confidence in his deputy's conduct, in terms that made it fairly clear that pursuing the matter further would constitute a poor use of everyone's time. Fitch had not pushed charges, but he had continued to simmer, and in September he had made a comment at the saloon within hearing of several people that included the phrase "respectable woman," which had been repeated back to Elsie, and which she had received with the exact expression of calm disdain that such comments deserved before saying something precise and devastating about the relative respectability of a married man running a mail fraud scheme, which had been repeated back to Fitch, and which had done some damage. But in October, Jasper received a letter forwarded from the Roswell sheriff that was the shape of the thing he had been building toward since April. The letter was from a woman named Grace Holloway in Clayton, New Mexico, who had experienced the exact same scheme from Gerald Fitch 2 years prior, and who had kept every letter as evidence. The Roswell sheriff was coordinating. There was, he wrote, sufficient documentation now for a formal fraud charge. Jasper sat with this letter for 24 hours and then went to Elsie. She read it at Clara Benton's kitchen table with Clara hovering in the doorway making tea that nobody asked for. "He has done this to someone else," she said. "At least once. There may be others. What happens if charges are brought? He faces trial, likely a fine, possibly a sentence. His reputation, what remains of it, is finished." Elsie folded the letter carefully along its creases. "Will it require me to testify?" "It may," Jasper said honestly. "If you are willing, your letters and your testimony would constitute strong evidence." She was quiet for a moment. "I kept the letters," she said. "All 17 of them. I brought them in the carpetbag. I was not sure why I kept them. I suppose I knew they might matter." "They will matter," he said. She looked at him. "Then let us proceed." The case against Gerald Fitch moved slowly. As territorial justice moved, through October and November, the letters exchanged with Roswell, the documentation gathered, the formal charges prepared. Fitch hired a lawyer from Albuquerque and made considerable noise about persecution and slander, but the documentation was what it was, and his lawyer was experienced enough to advise a quiet resolution rather than a trial. In the end, in early December, Gerald Fitch paid a substantial fine, made written restitution to both Elsie Langston and Grace Holloway, and left Redemption Creek for Santa Fe, where he presumably explained his departure to his wife in whatever terms he thought would serve him best. His ranch sold to a family from Texas in the spring. The stone house became a proper family home, and the view from the main street changed and became different. And Elsie, the first time she walked past it afterward, felt something release in her chest that she had not fully known she was still holding. Jasper and Elsie were married on the 28th of November, 1883, in the Protestant Church of Redemption Creek, on a morning that was cold and clear with the kind of pale blue sky that seems particular to high desert winter, enormous and crystalline, and without a single cloud. Clara Benton had spent 6 weeks making Elsie's dress from a bolt of deep cream wool she had ordered from Santa Fe, and it was the best work either of them had ever done, simple and exact and perfectly fitted. Pilar Vega came with her family and brought 3 dozen tamales for the reception at the church hall, which were the best things served and were consumed entirely within the first hour. Sheriff Calloway served as witness and looked moderately emotional about it, which he would deny for years. Old Tom Hatch the blacksmith came and cried openly, which surprised everyone including Tom Hatch. The Reverend asked the questions and they gave the answers, quietly and steadily in the way of people who mean everything they say. And when Jasper Warren took Elsie Langston's hand in front of that congregation, he held it with the same care he had held everything in their whole careful courtship, firm and gentle and completely real. Afterward, standing outside the church in the winter sunlight while the whole town seemed to want to shake their hands, Elsie leaned close to him and said quietly, "You know, the last time I arrived in this territory I had nowhere to sleep." "I know," he said, "and you slept in the stable so I could have shelter." The stable was perfectly adequate. Copper was good company. He was very good company. She took his arm and looked up at him with the expression he had been cataloging for 7 months, and which he now recognized as just her, just the specific face of a woman who was wholly present and wholly his. It is perhaps the least romantic origin story in the history of courtship. "I thought it was fairly romantic," he said. "You slept in a horse stall." "For you," he said, which made her laugh and press her forehead briefly to his shoulder and made Calloway, who was standing 3 feet away and absolutely watching, decide that he needed to go be somewhere else. They moved into a rented house on the western end of Redemption Creek in December, 2 rooms with a kitchen and a back porch overlooking a stretch of scrub and red clay, and Elsie immediately identified the south-facing corner of the front room as her sewing room and began filling it within the week. Jasper installed 2 shelves for her fabric and 1 very sturdy hook inside the front door for her second-best coat, and these small acts of arrangement felt like building something essential. The winter was quiet and long and genuinely good. There is a particular satisfaction to a winter spent with the right person. The way cold and enclosed spaces and short days stop being limiting and become instead a kind of gift. The enforced intimacy of early fires and early evenings, and the steady accumulation of shared small hours. They read together in the evenings, trading the same book back and forth since Redemption Creek had a limited library, arguing about characters in a way that was mostly about the pleasure of arguing. They cooked together, badly at first since Jasper's cooking skills were honest and limited and Elsie's were better, but learned for one and not two. And then better as they figured out the specific logic of feeding 2 people who were not the same person. He learned that she slept heavily but woke fast, completely alert in 1 second from full sleep. That she had a great deal of opinion about furniture arrangement and would occasionally rearrange things while he was at work, having thought through a better configuration. and then explained the reasoning to him in terms that were actually correct. That she was good with money in a way that went beyond careful frugality. That she had a sense of numbers and their implications that she had never had occasion to fully use, and that when he showed her the accounts he was keeping toward the possible purchase of their rented house, she sat down and spent an evening with them and came up with 3 adjustments that saved them 6 months. He loved her with the quiet totality that had been building since the night he had made a bed in a horse stall so that a stranger would have shelter. And it was nothing like what he had expected love to feel like, all those years ago before his brother died and before Missouri, and before the slow process of becoming himself again in a western town. It was not dramatic or overwhelming. It was constant, like a lamp that stayed lit, warm and functional and present, and the constancy of it was more extraordinary than drama would have been. She loved him differently than she had expected to love anyone. She had known, when she wrote those letters to Gerald Fitch, that she wanted a companion, a practical partnership with warmth in it. She had not expected that what she would actually want, when she found it, would be so specifically this man, his particular quiet and his particular humor, and the way he moved through the world with such unassuming integrity that people around him seemed to become better without quite knowing why. She had not expected to feel, when she looked at him across a room, like something was being said that required no language at all. Spring came back to the desert, and the wash ran with snowmelt from the northern hills, and Pilar Vega ran the sewing business with considerable independence, while Elsie handled the bookkeeping and the client relationships, and they both made more money together than Elsie had made alone. Jasper had, at Calloway's recommendation, and on the strength of 3 years of consistent and exemplary work, been offered the position of sheriff pending Calloway's retirement, which was being discussed for the following year. The offer came with a discussion that Jasper brought home to Elsie in May, sitting at their kitchen table with the warm evening coming in through the open window. "He's recommending me to the town council as his successor," he said. "It would mean more responsibility, more risk, some nights away when the county calls for it." He looked at his hands on the table. "I wanted to talk to you about it before I gave any answer." Elsie looked at him. "What do you want?" "I asked what you wanted first." "And I am asking you what you want," she said firmly. "I am your wife, Jasper, not a concern to be managed. If you want this position, tell me honestly and we will discuss what it means for us together. Do not tell me what you think I want to hear." He was quiet for a moment. "I want it," he said. "I think I am good at this work and I think I can do more of it with more authority. And I want to be honest that there are some things in this territory that bother me that I could address better from a position of more formal authority." He paused. "There are families in this county, Mexican families and Navajo families, who have been treated badly by men with badges. I would like to be the kind of law that is different from that. I think I could be." She looked at him for a long time. "Yes," she said. "Take the position, and I agree with everything you just said." He reached across the table and took her hand. They sat in the warm May evening for a while, making no plans and no calculations, just present in the kitchen of the house they were working toward owning, which they would finish paying for in the autumn. In June, Elsie told him she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning before church, in the kitchen, with the coffee on and the light coming in flat and gold through the window, and he went very still in the way he went still when something was extremely large, and then he stood up from the table and came around it and held her in a way that said everything he was too still to say. And she leaned into him and felt his arms around her and felt, for a long, clear moment, the absolute completeness of where she had arrived. "Are you frightened?" he asked against her hair. "Some," she admitted. "Are you?" "Some," he said, "and also the other thing." "Yes," she said, "the other thing." The other thing was enormous and warm and did not have a name that was adequate to it, but they both felt it, standing in their kitchen on a Sunday morning in June. The pregnancy was not easy in its first months. The summer heat was punishing and Elsie was sick in the mornings, with a regularity that she found infuriating given how much work she had to do. and Jasper was steady through all of it with a practical care that extended to rising early to have dry biscuits and weak tea ready before she was fully awake, which she told him once was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her, which he found disproportionate, but which she meant precisely. The sickness passed by late summer, and Elsie came back to herself with a kind of energy that surprised even her, a second wind that she directed in approximately 6 directions at once, and Jasper watched it with quiet awe and some concern that she was overdoing it, and she told him firmly that she was managing her own body, and that he might redirect his concern toward the new bookcase she wanted in the sewing room, and he built the bookcase. Ben Calloway formally retired in October of 1884, handing Jasper his sheriff's star with the same undemonstrative efficiency with which he handled everything. The town council had approved the appointment unanimously. There was a small celebration at the diner, and Calloway drank 1 glass of whiskey, made a brief speech that was almost entirely about Jasper's professional qualities and barely mentioned that he liked the man enormously, and then retired to his house on the hill where he had a garden he intended to spend the rest of his life improving. Jasper wore the new star home that evening, and Elsie looked at it on his chest for a moment. "Sheriff Warren," she said. "Strange," he said. "It suits you," she said. Their son was born in December of 1884, on a cold and clear night very like the night of their wedding, and he was named Daniel after Jasper's brother, which had been Jasper's only request, and which Elsie had agreed to with the simplicity of a woman who understands that honoring the beloved dead is not a competition. Daniel Warren was a healthy and loud child who had his father's brown eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw, and who, within the first month, had completely reorganized the household around his requirements in ways that neither of his parents had anticipated or could dispute, because he was so entirely himself from the very first that resistance seemed beside the point. Jasper held his son in those first weeks with the specific wonder of a man who had not expected to have this, who had come to it through a circuitous route of loss and displacement and a night in a horse stall, and who understood that the circuitousness was not waste, but was in fact the path that had led him here, precisely here, to this room and this woman and this child. Elsie watched him and felt something complete itself that she had not known was incompletable, which is the particular feeling of witnessing the person you love in an entirely new dimension of themselves. Clara Benton became Daniel's de facto grandmother, arriving on Tuesdays and Thursdays with food and practical advice, and a willingness to sit with the baby while Elsie worked that was not offered as charity, but as the straightforward pleasure of a woman who loved a child and a household that had become central to her own life. Pilar Vega brought the baby a blanket stitched by her grandmother and held him carefully for exactly 3 minutes before handing him back, saying she had her own cousins and was not short on babies, but that he was a fine one. Old Tom Hatch made a small wooden horse, beautifully carved, which lived on the shelf above Daniel's crib and which he would later, at age 3, attempt to eat. The winter passed and Daniel grew, and the town settled into the new rhythm of its law, which was different under Jasper than it had been under Calloway, not because Calloway had been unjust, but because Jasper brought to the office a specific quality of attention to who was being poorly served and why, and acted on it quietly and consistently until the acting had effects. The Vega family had been in a land dispute with a neighboring rancher named Sherwood for years, the kind of dispute that resolved badly for families without connections when the law looked the other way. Jasper reviewed the original land grants, which were in Spanish and which he had Pilar Vega translate, and found that the Vega claim was correct and the Sherwood encroachment was documented and clear. He brought the matter to the Territorial Land Office with complete and organized evidence, and the Vega family received their boundary back in the spring of 1885, something that had seemed impossible for 7 years. Elsie heard about this from Pillar, not from Jasper, because Jasper did not tell her about it because he did not understand this to be extraordinary, and she went home that evening and found him reading and sat across from him and said, "You restored the Vega land." He looked up. Pillar cried, telling me about it. The evidence was very clear. The previous administration just hadn't looked at it. Jasper. He put the book down and looked at her, this man she had married, wearing the star of the sheriff of Redemption Creek in his own kitchen with baby Daniel asleep in the back room and the lamp burning between them. And she saw in him the same thing she had seen that first night in the jailhouse doorway, the core of him, the thing that did not change. "You are exactly what you appeared to be," she said. "From the very beginning. There was no hidden version, no dark secret, just this." He looked at her. "Is that sufficient?" "It is more than sufficient," she said. "It is everything." He held out his hand across the table, and she took it, and they sat together in the lamplight with no need to say anything more about it. Summer of 1885 was lively in the territory, new settlers coming through, the railroad expanding toward the northern part of the county, a new wave of families arriving with their children and their ambitions and their particular forms of hope. Redemption Creek grew, not dramatically, but steadily, and Jasper and Elsie grew with it, their lives woven into the fabric of the town in ways that had happened gradually and completely. Daniel turned 1 in December and stood on his own 2 feet at the party, wobbling magnificently, and then sat down hard and seemed unbothered by this, and the room full of people who had come to celebrate his birthday applauded as though it were the finest thing they had ever witnessed, which, in the particular calculation of people who love a child, it was. In the spring of 1886, Elsie and Jasper celebrated their 3rd anniversary with a dinner that Elsie cooked, and that was excellent, having solved the 2-person cooking problem some years prior, and afterward they sat on the porch of the house they now fully owned, having made the final payment in February, and listened to the desert night. "I have been thinking," Elsie said. "I have noticed," Jasper said, which was true. She had been pressing her thumbnail to her lower lip for 3 days, which was his indicator. "The schoolhouse has had no permanent teacher for 8 months. The position is mine if I want it. Pillar can handle the sewing business largely without me. She has been doing so already, and I would be home by 4 in the afternoon." He looked at her. "What does the pay compare to the sewing?" "It is better, actually, and it is something I have been wanting to do since I arrived." "Then you should do it," he said simply. "You do not want to discuss it." "I have discussed it," he said. "It took 3 seconds. You want to teach. You are good with people and good at explaining things, and you care about it." "The pay is better. What is there to discuss?" She laughed at him. "Most men would have opinions about their wife's employment. I have an opinion. My opinion is that you should do what you are suited for and that this suits you." He looked at her sideways. "Also, Daniel will be school age in a few years, and it would be interesting." "Oh, that is not allowed," she said immediately. "He cannot be in my classroom. I suspect he'll be exactly the kind of student his mother would not want in her classroom. That is a deeply concerning statement about our son's character. He threw his breakfast this morning. He is 1.5. He threw it with intent." She was laughing properly now, and he was watching her laugh, which was still something he could not be entirely casual about. And the porch and the night and the owned house behind them and the sleeping child within it were all so precisely the life he had not known he was making his way toward that the feeling of it was sometimes almost more than he could account for. "Elsie," he said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." She turned to face him, giving him the full attention she always gave, unhurried and complete. "I think about that night sometimes," he said. "The night you came in, the storm. I think about what would have happened if I had been out on patrol, or if you had tried the hotel first, or if any of 100 things had been different." He was quiet for a moment. "I do not say this to dramatize it. I say it because I want you to know that I understand the weight of what happened that night, that I understand it was a beginning of something that I had no way to see the end of, and that knowing the end of it now." He stopped. He was not, as he had told her once, good at saying things. "I am grateful every single day," he said finally. "I want you to know that." Elsie looked at him in the porch light, this man who had given up his quarters so she had somewhere to sleep, who had taken every care with her from the first moment without asking for anything in return, who had loved her with such steady, permanent, unperforming care that she still sometimes had to stop and hold it a moment, the reality of it, before she could continue. "I know," she said, "and so am I." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat like that for a while, watching the stars over the desert, listening to the night. And somewhere inside the house, Daniel made a small sound in his sleep and then went quiet, dreaming whatever small dreams a child of 1.5 carries into the dark. 2 years passed with the warmth and ordinary remarkable abundance of two people building a life that fits them perfectly. Jasper re-won his sheriff's election in the fall of 1886 by the largest margin in the town's voting history, which Calloway reported to him from his garden with considerable satisfaction. Elsie's schoolroom became known throughout the county as a place where children of all families, settler and Hispano and the occasional Apache child whose family had settled near town, were treated with equal rigor and equal respect, which caused some complaint from certain quarters, and which Elsie addressed with the same precise calm she brought to everything. Clara Benton adopted a cat and named it Deputy because she said it had Jasper's eyes and his manner of watching things without commenting, which Jasper refused to be offended by because it was too accurate. Pilar Vega expanded the sewing business into proper tailoring and hired 2 additional seamstresses, and turned down an offer from a shop in Santa Fe because, she said, she preferred where she was. In the autumn of 1887, their second child arrived, a girl this time, born in October with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quality of being absolutely present, of seeming to take in everything around her from the very first moment with complete and focused attention. They named her Margaret, not after the woman in Missouri, but after Elsie's mother, and the name settled onto the small, serious face as though it had always belonged there. Daniel, now nearly 3, regarded his sister with the combination of fascinated interest and mild suspicion that is common to firstborn children suddenly redistributed from center stage, and managed, within the first week, to share his carved wooden horse with her voluntarily, which Jasper considered a very encouraging indicator of character. The house, already full, became fuller, and the fullness of it was not burden but abundance, the specific abundance of rooms that are lived in completely, of tables that have people at them, of a life that has reached the shape it was always meant to find. On a December evening in 1887, 4 years after the storm that had driven a woman in a torn dress through a jailhouse door, Jasper Warren sat on the porch of his house with his daughter asleep against his chest and his son at his feet, building an incomprehensible structure out of sticks, and his wife brought 2 cups of coffee from the kitchen and handed him one and sat down beside him and looked at the cold, clear stars over the desert. "Do you remember what you said to me?" she asked. "That first night," he thought, "I said something about the mattress," she laughed quietly. "Before that, when I told you I had nowhere to go," he remembered. Standing in the office with her soaked and proud and barely holding together, the storm outside and the lamp between them and everything unknown. "I told you to come inside." "You told me to come inside," she agreed. "Just that. Just come inside, and here is shelter and here is a fire and you will be safe." She was quiet for a moment. That is the whole story, really. The whole 4 years of it in those 4 words. He looked at her, this woman who had come in out of a storm 4 years ago and who had never, in all the time since, been anything other than completely, specifically, irreplaceably herself. "I would do it again," he said. "Every part of it." "I know you would," she said. "That is why I love you." The stars kept their watch over the high desert. The child on his chest breathed in small, even rhythms. The child at his feet arranged his sticks with great concentration and absolute confidence in the significance of his work. Redemption Creek settled into its winter night, its houses lit, its people at their fires, its particular history of small braveries and ordinary loves continuing quietly in all its rooms. Jasper Warren held his daughter and drank his coffee and sat with his family in the cold, clear dark, and felt, in the simple and complete way of a man who has arrived where he belongs, that every road he had taken to get here, the loss and the displacement and the long route west and one very particular night in a horse stall, had been necessary and right and worth every step. Elsie reached over and took his free hand in both of hers, and they stayed like that until the cold drove them in, and then they went inside to their warm and full and thoroughly imperfect and deeply loved life, and closed the door behind them,